So things absolutely extraordinary, rapidly escalating, but extremely dark, are emerging from inside Iran. Ever since the regime imposed a nationwide blackout from the 8th of January, it has been impossible to ascertain the reality of the situation on the ground. But the latest of assessments being that up to 12,000 people have now been killed by the IRGC and security forces, moving from city by city to absolutely crush the protesters and what's happening in the public view. So this is no longer just an unrest or even an uprising. One of the bloodiest crackdowns by an autocratic entity that has been carried out for decades anywhere in the world, deliberately being hidden behind information so dark and so grim that it is impossible to know how to react, how to feel, but also what to do to support the Iranian people. But despite the level of violence, the regime is still holding out, and reasonably well, it seems. So that brings us to the core of what is here, that Iran looks closer to the collapse than it has at any other point since the Islamic Republic and the revolution of 1979. But it is not about yet to collapse, and therefore it is the importance of foreign influence here that could be the determining factor. These nationwide protests with upwards of thousands now killed, the collapsing currency and the food prices all but out of control, Donald Trump is upping the likelihood of military intervention. And after all of this, Trump making it very clear that there is a post-regime thing in the works, with secret sources stating that Steve Witkoff, Trump's unique envoy, having met with the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi just as I record this video. Now, new tariffs are being announced on countries that do business with Tehran, receiving reaction from China. And Trump himself has said that the United States will do something. Help is coming. But of course, what does that mean? And how much can it make a difference when the people of Iran need that help right now? So the core questions of this are, is this the moment that Iran does finally trip into a moment of forcible change? Or is it another case where outside pressure misunderstands how the regime actually works and whether or not the system is about to collapse? Because once you look past the rhetoric, the picture becomes a lot more complicated as always. But, crucially for Iranian people, far more dangerous. It's not a story of just the protests anymore. It's about how regimes survive moments like this and whether or not they look fatal and what comes next. All that coming up in this video. Stay tuned.
This is The Global Gambit.
How are we going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel, where if you're new here, we look at international relations, geopolitics, and economics. And while we often focus on Russia-Ukraine, the severity and magnitude of what's happening in Iran demands and deserves attention. If you are from Iran, do message me if you want on Twitter. I am taking as many DMs as I can if you're on the ground and do what I can to help. And that includes with this video. If you want, please do drop your comments below as well. Just also for your share of support, people, solidarity, but also if you have any thoughts about what we cover in this video, because it's a big one. So as you know, the protest started on December 28th when Iran's experienced nationwide unrest and, well, it was seen as a significant moment because the protests weren't just about social issues, as we saw in Masa Amini in 2022. It was about economics. Economically, the country is in deep problems. Food price inflation has exceeded 70%. The rial has fallen to record lows, and the sanctions that return with full force after the reimposition of last year's UN sanctions, or otherwise known as the step back mechanism, which I actually alluded to in a video from September. Now, there is so much happening right now that it is impossible to stay completely on top of everything, but I am doing my best to provide deeper dives on broader themed issues that affect the Iranian people, such as a video that I made a couple of days ago, as well as another one on the Russian relationship, and another specific one that many of you have requested that will be coming out soon. So if you want to stay tuned for that, do consider subscribing and ringing the bell. But let's get back to it. Now, there's a well-worn line used to describe how systems collapse. They don't fall apart at once. They decay gradually. We can see that in the case of Russia, where the economy is not on imminent collapse, but of course things are getting incredibly bad. But that's the point. Suddenly there's a day, a moment where it all just falls apart. Look at Syria, the end of 2024. Many protesters and many outside observers in the case of Iran have hoped Iran will suddenly reach this sudden phase. We've seen this in the past where each time there's a new round of protests, the idea of revolution is imminent. As much as I'd like to see the Islamic Republic gone, it's never that, well, that's not how it works, put it that way. And this is the first major re-anchor point of this video, which is regimes don't fall when people protest. They fall when the coercive systems that they created and uphold fracture. The single most important reason is this: the security forces remain fiercely loyal. Since the Islamic Revolution in 1979, Iran's political systems have been built around this repression as a permanent feature, not a temporary response. Over decades, the regime has invested heavily in its internal security, in some ways more than its own external, designed specifically to survive moments like this. At the center of this, of course, sits the IRGC, or Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It's not another military unit. It exists to defend the ideology and the political system of the Islamic Republic itself. It doesn't respond to the president. It responds to Khamenei, the supreme leader. It operates parallel to Iran's conventional military forces known as the Artesh, who themselves have pledged a willingness to clamp down on the protests. And it is deeply, as in the IRGC, embedded in the economy, industries, infrastructure. Estimates put its armed strength at around 150,000, but its real power comes from its auxiliary forces, particularly what's known as the Bashij militia, a vast paramilitary network that can mobilize hundreds of thousands just in the click of a finger. And these forces have been confronting protests already, and is likely one of the core sources of these mass casualties that we are seeing. But crucially, they still have not fractured. And we have seen this before. After a disputed election, Iran experienced massive demonstrations. Entire districts of Tehran effectively paralyzed. Yet within weeks, the regime did regain that control. Bashij units then lined the streets, and the armed forces stood behind them. Motorcycle squads moved quickly through crowds, breaking up gatherings of any form, and protests that once filled avenues were reduced to very small isolated groups, often then with very dark consequences. Any rooftop chants faded, and the movement lost momentum. Now that history matters because it tells us something very uncomfortable, that Iran's leadership knows how to survive and rest. It has very, very recent examples by this. So you see the pattern. When security forces stay loyal and pressure comes from the outside, regimes harden rather than crack, and unfortunately take it out on their own citizens. So the idea that any military strike could protect the protesters is flawed. So it brings us back to the central question: what could happen next? Donald Trump's options. Well, there is something quietly happening behind the scenes, because how Washington reacts to moments like this often tells us more than any official statements do. Keep in mind that a large proportion of what happened in the summer was misdirection, deliberate opaqueness. Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, for example, has secretly met with Iran's former Crown Prince or exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi. This is the first high-level contact between the Trump administration and Reza Pahlavi since the protests began. It matters far more than you might think. Pahlavi is the son of the Shah, deposed in 1979, and has been attempting to position himself as a potential transitional figure if the regime were to fall. Now, over the past couple of weeks, he has appeared repeatedly on US television networks, openly called for the Trump administration to intervene in support, and behind the scenes, the White House has been holding meetings on possible responses to the unrest. What options do they have? Trump himself has not always attended, and senior officials have stressed that deliberations are still at the earlier stages. But at this point, according to some officials that I've spoken to, the administration is primarily examining non-kinetic means. Great ideas of what that could look like. Check out a previous video I made. Even as Trump continues to issue deliberately ambiguous public statements, again, I think that's part of the ruse. And so this is the glaring gap between the rhetoric and the action. If Western governments are serious about increasing pressure without some form of military action, one of the most immediate steps is diplomatic. For me, it is bizarre, frankly insulting to the Iranian people, that ambassadors or senior intelligence-linked diplomats are not being expelled from Western embassies. Dismantling the regime's official presence across European capitals is a crucial move. They're not neutral institutions. They function as nodes of intelligence collection, hubs, surveillance of the Iranian diaspora and regime influence operations abroad. We know how well the Iranian regime has been at managing proxy networks, at least until a couple of years ago. So shutting them down is a concrete signal that Europe especially can demonstrate in its commitment to the Iranian people, not just strongly worded statements, which, as I made in another video, is something that must change if Europe wants to be taken seriously. From the US perspective, it has overwhelming military power. Venezuela is no shortage of demonstration for that. Potential targets could include the military infrastructure or senior leadership themselves. Trump has demonstrated a willingness to do this, as we saw with the killing of Qasem Soleimani during the end of his first term. But military planners and former officials are blunt about this, that there is no clear military solution. Launching strikes in the name of protecting protesters is a possible but not realistic military objective. What I mean by that is air power can destroy buildings, but it can't compel defections. It can't dismantle the entire security apparatus that is ideologically committed and deeply entrenched. In fact, in some people's eyes, it could risk achieving the opposite. It's where the external pressure stops being a leverage and actually becomes life support, because it sort of delegitimizes the Western intentions and makes the regime say, look, we're being attacked by foreign adversaries. That's precisely the danger of elevating people like Reza Pahlavi too quickly either, according to some people. One of the regime's most powerful narratives is that Iran is under attack from foreign enemies, as they say. But this idea of the Crown Prince being returned is simply that they want to reimpose a stooge government for the sake of their own self-interests in the West, oil and such. So despite the deep internal divisions, it quickly becomes clear that, history shows us external military pressure often pushes societies to rally around the state. We've seen this last summer after the Trump administration's engagements, shall we call them, in Operation Rising Lion. But in some ways, this situation is so different. The atrocities that the regime has now committed makes it more ambiguous as to how the Iranian people would react if the Americans were to get involved. Personally, I don't think it would be quite the same as we would have seen in the past. Now, Trump has said help is on its way, but of course those words are ambiguous because they're designed to create this pressure. But they also feed directly into the regime's narrative in some ways. And it's a delicate balancing act that the US especially has to get right. Then there are, of course, practical constraints that make Iran fundamentally different from, say, Venezuela. Access, geography is the first problem. It's much larger, more geographically complex, and far more heavily defended. Distances are greater, margins for error are therefore smaller, and there's no equivalent of quietly extracting a leader from a permissive environment. And then, of course, to retaliation. Tehran has vowed to strike any US assets across the region in response to an American attack, and Trump has said overwhelming retaliation to Iran's retaliation. So we get the retaliation cycle again. But that's how escalation spirals begin, and the moment when the US military footprint in the region has to be taken into account as well, because it's actually been reduced. Assets have been redeployed elsewhere, say in Southern Asia, and Washington is not posturing for a prolonged conflict, which is unlikely if it was primarily airstrikes. So it's these sorts of contradictions and the realities, the pragmatic considerations that are also crucial to keep in mind. Now, from the Trump administration, for Trump, he prefers, say, leverage over commitment, in that the administration had actually had a fair amount of uncertainty about Pahlavi as a political actor. Trump himself had declined to actually endorse him publicly earlier on. But things are beginning to change as more and more evidence comes out about just how many Iranian people seem to be directly referencing the Shah or calling for a return to pre-1979. Trump therefore values unpredictability, and he wants to keep adversaries guessing, including how much Reza Pahlavi may be playing as a role in a post-Islamic Republic Iran. But he also repeatedly steps back from the brink, so to say. He escalates rhetorically, then pivots, sometimes abruptly, to diplomacy. And we are seeing that pattern again here. After hinting at military action, he then also signals renewed interest in talks around the nuclear deal, or reducing Iran's nuclear program. And negotiations, though however unlikely to succeed, could buy Iran time. We cannot deny that they are pragmatic and cunning when it comes to the use of diplomacy. All of this, though, is about ambiguity, and Trump is the wild card. Iran knows it, but they are also seasoned players themselves, and so we can't count them out completely. Indeed, from Tehran's perspective, the overriding priority is about survival. And from Washington's perspective, the emergence of this potential opposition figure creates both temptation, but of course risk. Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, is aging. He's over 85 and the system under immense strain. But the immediate goal here is not reform, it is preservation for them. That means suppressing unrest forcibly while probing for ways to relieve external pressure. Negotiations, even if fruitless, serves that purpose. And therefore people are cautioning about Pahlavi's appeal not being overstated. Public opinion polling over recent years, however true you can take it, suggests only 1/3 of Iranians really support it, whilst a similar share actually oppose it. Still higher than any recognition of other opposition figures, mind you. That does not mean there is any really consensus around leadership, only that in the absence of alternatives, some Iranians may be willing to accept the Reza Pahlavi as a temporary lesser evil. So where in all of this does it leave Iran right now? Well, we are back at the same uncomfortable conclusion, that authoritarian systems rarely collapse on schedule. They endure far longer than outside people predict, and then suddenly they're gone, or a slightly different variation. There are warning signs in this case, though, that the economic collapse, the popular resentment, and the example of Syria, as well as the loss of all their proxies, is a system that is really unraveling rapidly, especially if foreign intervention does occur. Historical precedents exist as well. Tunisia, Egypt. In both those cases, the decisive moment came not from the protesters alone, but from the armed forces choosing not to save the ruler. Could that happen in Iran? Perhaps, but it's difficult to say right now. We'll have to keep covering this as much as we can in the coming days ahead. But that's it from me, everyone. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, do give it a like, subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next update. Things are moving fast. If you want to support the Iranian people, then do follow me on X and tell me the best